The wind did not howl. It screamed. It shrieked with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if the storm had come specifically for the people of Hadley, Nebraska, as if it meant to punish them for the sin of believing they could survive on a treeless plain with nothing but lumber and hope. The temperature had dropped to 31 degrees below zero, and the wooden houses that lined the main street of town were dying, not burning, freezing. The thin plank walls that had seemed adequate in October were bleeding heat into the howling darkness faster than any stove could replace it. Families huddled around cook stoves that glowed cherry red and still could not warm the rooms they occupied. Frost crept across interior walls. Water froze in pitchers set 3 feet from the fire. Children wept from cold that no blanket could defeat. On the morning of January 13th, 1888, when the schoolhouse blizzard finally paused long enough for men to venture outside and assess the damage, they found that 11 of Hadley's 43 structures had been rendered uninhabitable. Not destroyed, the buildings still stood, but so thoroughly frozen that the families within had been forced to flee or die. The Hoffman family had abandoned their home at 3 a.m, carrying their children through snowdrifts to the church, which had a larger stove and thicker walls. The Petersons had burned their furniture, their doors, and finally their floorboards, trying to maintain enough heat to survive until dawn. Old Mrs. Lindstrom had not been so fortunate. They found her sitting in her rocking chair, frozen solid, a quilt pulled up to her chin, as if she had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. But half a mile west of town, where the Loop River curved through a shallow valley, a different scene awaited those who ventured out to check on the strange man who had built his house out of hay. Jonas Eriksson opened his door to greet the search party with a cup of hot coffee in his hand and his shirt sleeves rolled up. Behind him, through the doorway, the searchers could see a room that was not merely warm, but comfortable. A fire burning steadily in a modest stove, no frost on the windows, no ice on the floor, a temperature that must have been 60 degrees or more. His gray dun mare, Rye, whinnied from the attached stable, clearly as content as her master. "Gentlemen," Jonas said, his voice carrying the faint lilt of his Swedish homeland. "I was about to come looking for you. I thought perhaps you might need shelter." The men stared at him, then at the house behind him. The absurd house, the impossible house, the structure they had mocked and ridiculed for 2 years as the most foolish building ever erected in Nebraska. The house with walls made of hay. It should have been an oven for the flames. It should have been a haven for vermin. It should have collapsed under its own absurd weight, or rotted in the first rain, or simply disintegrated in the prairie wind. Instead, it stood solid and warm, while wooden houses all around it had become death traps. Jonas Eriksson had arrived in the Nebraska sandhills in the spring of 1885, a widower of 41, whose wife, Britta, had died of pneumonia 3 winters prior in their Minnesota homestead. The pneumonia had come from the cold. The cold had come from the house, a standard wooden structure with walls too thin to hold heat through the brutal Minnesota winters. Jonas had watched his wife shiver and cough and waste away, and he had understood, with a clarity that grief sometimes brings, that the house he had built had killed her as surely as any disease. He would not make that mistake again. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're on the plains, in the mountains, or somewhere the wind cuts just as cold. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the blizzard arrives and every wooden house fails. Jonas had grown up in the Dalarna region of Sweden, where winters were long and lumber was precious, and the old farmers had developed methods of construction that Americans had never learned. His grandfather, Olaf, had built barns with walls of compacted straw, walls 3 feet thick that held heat like stone and cost nothing but labor. The technique was ancient, brought to Scandinavia by settlers who had no forest to cut, but endless fields of grain that left behind mountains of straw each harvest. A wall of compacted straw, Olaf had taught him, was warmer than brick, cheaper than lumber, and would last a lifetime if properly protected from moisture. Jonas had helped his grandfather build such a barn when he was 14 years old. He had learned how to stack the bales, how to compress them, how to plaster the surfaces with a mixture of clay and lime that sealed the straw from weather and vermin. He had slept in that barn during a January storm when the temperature dropped to 40 below, and he had been warm. He carried that knowledge across the Atlantic, but in Minnesota, he had not used it. Lumber was available there, and cheap, and everyone built with lumber. To build with straw would have marked him as a poor man, a foreigner, someone who did not understand how things were done in America. So he had built a wooden house like his neighbors, and his wife had died in it, and Jonas had learned that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Nebraska was different. Nebraska, specifically the Sandhills region where Jonas filed his claim, had almost no trees. The few cottonwoods that grew along the rivers were jealously guarded, and lumber shipped from the east cost more than most homesteaders could pay. Sod houses were common, dwellings made of cut prairie earth, with all the disadvantages of dirt walls, damp, dark, prone to leaking, inhabited by insects and snakes that burrowed in from the surrounding soil. Jonas looked at the landscape and saw something else entirely. He saw grass, endless grass, tall and thick, that the ranchers cut for hay each summer and stacked in enormous quantities to feed their cattle through the winter. Hay that was, essentially, the same material his grandfather had used to build walls in Sweden. He would build a Hay-Bale house. His claim was 160 acres along the Lou River, good grazing land with a gentle slope that would drain water away from any structure built upon it. He filed his paperwork, paid his fees, and began to plan. The first step was the foundation. His grandfather had always insisted that straw must never touch the earth, because ground moisture would wick up into the bales and rot them from within. Jonas built a foundation of limestone blocks, quarried from an outcropping 2 miles distant and hauled to the site by rye. The foundation rose 2 feet above the ground, high enough to keep the hay well clear of any moisture. The bales came next. He spent the summer of 1885 cutting prairie grass, drying it, and compressing it into dense rectangular bales, using a simple wooden press he built himself. Each bale was 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches tall, weighing nearly 70 pounds when properly compressed. The density was crucial. Loose hay would settle and shift, but bales compressed to the proper tightness held their shape indefinitely. He stacked the bales like enormous bricks, staggering the joints, pinning them together with long wooden stakes driven down through multiple layers. The walls rose slowly, 3 bales thick at the base, tapering to 2 bales at the top, creating a mass of insulation nearly 4 feet thick at ground level. A wooden frame at the top supported the roof, a conventional structure of rafters and planking that he covered with sod for additional insulation. The interior and exterior surfaces he plastered with a mixture of clay, lime, and sand, applied in multiple coats and smoothed to a finish that was surprisingly handsome. The plaster sealed the straw completely, protecting it from moisture, fire, and vermin. When it dried, the walls were as hard as concrete and considerably warmer. The house took 2 years to complete. When it was finished, it had 4 rooms, a sleeping loft, and an attached stable where Rye could shelter in the worst weather. The walls were over 3 feet thick. The windows were small and deep-set, framed with salvaged lumber. The whole structure looked like nothing else in Nebraska, a low, rounded, almost organic building that seemed to grow from the prairie rather than sit upon it. The people of Hadley noticed immediately. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. Horace Brennan was the first to voice what many were thinking. Brennan was the lumber merchant who supplied most of the building materials in the Hadley area, shipping planks and boards from the eastern forests at prices that reflected both transportation costs and his own substantial profit margin. A man who built without lumber was a man who did not need Horace Brennan, and Brennan took such independence personally. "The Swede has built himself a haystack," Brennan announced at his lumber yard, where homesteaders gathered to purchase materials and exchange gossip. "A haystack with windows. He means to live in it like a field mouse. I give it 1 winter before it collapses, burns, or fills with rats." The mockery spread through Hadley with the speed of all small-town gossip. Jonas Ericsson's hay house became the favorite joke of the settlement, a monument to foreign foolishness, proof that Scandinavians did not understand proper construction. Mayor Clement Ferris, a cautious man who had made his modest fortune by never disagreeing with anyone who might be useful to him, paid a visit to Jonas's claim in the autumn of 1886 after the house was completed. "Mr. Ericsson," he said, examining the plastered walls with obvious skepticism, "I must confess I've never seen anything like this. You've built a house out of hay?" "Compressed hay bales," Jonas corrected, "stacked and plastered. The technique is common in Sweden. My grandfather built a barn this way that stood for 60 years. "But surely," Ferris gestured vaguely, "the fire risk alone—" "The plaster protects the hay from flame," Jonas explained. "A plastered hay bale is actually more fire-resistant than wood. The straw cannot burn if air cannot reach it. And vermin, insects, cannot penetrate the plaster. The walls are sealed completely." Ferris shook his head slowly, unconvinced. "Well, Mr. Ericsson, I wish you luck. But I must tell you honestly, if this structure fails, if it burns or collapses or proves uninhabitable, the settlement cannot be responsible for providing you with alternative shelter. You've chosen to build in a manner that no one here can endorse." "I understand," Jonas said. "I am not asking for endorsement, only for the opportunity to prove that the old ways sometimes know things the new ways have forgotten. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The winter of 1886 to 87 was harsh, and Jonas's house performed exactly as he had expected. While his neighbors burned through cords of firewood, trying to heat their thin-walled wooden structures, Jonas maintained a comfortable temperature with a modest stove and a fraction of the fuel. The hay-bale walls did not merely slow the passage of heat, they stopped it almost entirely. The cold that knifed through plank walls simply could not penetrate 4 feet of compressed grass. He kept records, as he kept records of everything. outside temperature versus inside temperature, fuel consumed per day, comfort levels at various locations within the house. The data confirmed what his body already knew. His Hay-Bale house was warmer than any wooden structure in Hadley, at a fraction of the heating cost. He shared these records with anyone who would listen, which was almost no one. The Mockery had hardened into received wisdom. Everyone knew that Jonas Eriksson's hay house was a foolish experiment that would fail eventually. The fact that it had not yet failed simply meant that the failure was still coming. One good storm, Brennan predicted, and that haystack will blow apart like dandelion fluff. The Swede will come crawling to my lumber yard, begging for proper materials, and I will sell them to him at whatever price the market will bear. The winter passed without incident. The hay house stood solid. Jonas weathered the cold in comfort while his neighbors shivered and cursed and fed their stoves the lumber that Brennan sold them at premium prices. Spring brought a brief respite from the Mockery as the settlers of Hadley turned their attention to planting and the 1,000 tasks of the agricultural season. But the whispers continued beneath the surface, and Jonas remained an outsider, the foreigner with his strange house, his strange methods, his strange insistence that the old ways were better. He made no effort to convert his critics. He simply continued to live in his comfortable house, maintain his records, and wait for the day when the evidence would speak for itself. That day came on January 12th, 1888. The morning dawned warm, impossibly, suspiciously warm for mid-January in Nebraska. The temperature climbed past 40 degrees, and the snow that had accumulated began to soften and drip from rooftops. Children were sent to school in light coats. Farmers ventured out to check on stock. The whole territory seemed to relax, grateful for a break from the winter's grip. Jonas felt the change in the air and did not trust it. He had seen such weather in Sweden, the false warmth that preceded the worst storms, the calm before the frozen fury. He spent the morning reinforcing his hay house's door seals, checking the plaster for cracks, ensuring that his fuel supply was adequate. Rye watched him from her stall with the patient curiosity of a horse who trusted her master's instincts. The blizzard struck at mid-afternoon, falling on the plains like a hammer. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in less than an hour. The wind rose from a whisper to a roar, driving snow horizontally with enough force to blind and suffocate anyone caught in the open. Day became darkness. The world outside vanished into a white void of screaming wind and frozen death. In Hadley, the wooden houses began to fail almost immediately. The walls that had seemed adequate in moderate cold were no match for temperatures of 30 below zero, combined with winds of 60 miles per hour. Heat poured out through the planking faster than any stove could replace it. Families burned everything they could find: furniture, spare lumber, fence posts, anything that would catch flame. And still the cold crept in, inexorable and merciless. The first refugees arrived at Jonas's house 2 hours after the storm began. The Hoffman family, parents and 4 children, had fled their wooden house when the temperature inside dropped below freezing, despite a stove burning at full capacity. They had stumbled through the darkness, guided by rope tied between buildings, and had seen the faint glow of lamplight through Jonas's windows. They pounded on his door, and Jonas opened it to find 6 frozen, terrified people begging for shelter. "Come in," he said simply. "There is room." The Hoffmans entered and stopped, staring. The house was warm, not merely survivable, but genuinely comfortable, a temperature of perhaps 65 degrees, maintained by a stove burning at a fraction of the intensity of the ones they had left behind. After hours in a house that felt like a meat locker, the warmth was almost painful. "How?" whispered Mrs. Hoffman, clutching her youngest child. "How is this possible?" "The walls," Jonas said. 4 feet of compressed hay. The cold cannot pass through." More refugees arrived through the night. The Petersons, who had burned their furniture and were preparing to burn their floor when a neighbor told them about the Swedes' hay house. The Carlson brothers, bachelor farmers, who shared a drafty cabin that had become uninhabitable within an hour of the storm's arrival. Young Thomas Brennan, the lumber merchant's own son, who had been caught at school when the blizzard hit and had made his way to the nearest shelter he could find, which happened to be the house his father had mocked most viciously. By midnight, 31 people were packed into Jonas's Hay-Bale house. It was crowded, uncomfortable, and the air grew thick with the breath of too many bodies in too small a space. But it was warm. The stove burned steadily, fed by a modest supply of fuel, and the 4-foot walls held the heat inside, while the killing cold raged impotently outside. They stayed for 3 days. The blizzard did not relent until the morning of January 15th. When it finally exhausted itself, Jonas opened his door to a world transformed. The snow had drifted in waves across the prairie, burying fences and outbuildings, reshaping the landscape into something alien and white. The temperature remained brutal, 15 below zero in the bright sunshine. But the wind had stopped, and that made all the difference. The survivors ventured out to check their homes. What they found was sobering. 11 of Hadley's 43 structures had been rendered uninhabitable. Wooden walls had cracked from the cold. Pipes had burst. In some cases, the fire damage from desperate attempts to maintain heat had done more harm than the cold itself. The Peterson house had no floor left. They had burned every plank to survive. The Carlson cabin's door had frozen shut and had to be chopped open with axes. And old Mrs. Lindstrom was dead. She had stayed in her tiny wooden house, alone, refusing to leave, and the cold had taken her sometime in the first night. They found her frozen in her chair, a peaceful expression on her face, as if she had simply closed her eyes and drifted away. The discovery silenced the settlement. The mockery that had followed Jonas for 2 years evaporated in the face of a death that might have been prevented if anyone had listened to him. Mrs. Lindstrom had lived 300 yards from his Hay-Bale house. If she had come to him, if she had accepted shelter in the structure everyone called foolish, she would have lived. A gathering was held at the church on January 20th, when the weather had moderated enough for travel. The people of Hadley assembled to mourn Mrs. Lindstrom, to assess the damage, and to reckon with what had happened. Mayor Ferris spoke first, his cautious voice heavy with an emotion that political calculation could not disguise. "We lost a neighbor this week," he said. Margaret Lindstrom froze to death in her home, 300 yards from a house that remained warm throughout the blizzard. She died because she stayed where she was, and she stayed where she was because none of us, myself included, took seriously the methods that might have saved her. He turned to face Jonas, who stood at the back of the church as he always did, uncomfortable with attention. "Mr. Erickson, you built a house that we called foolish. We mocked it. We called it a haystack, a fire trap, a monument to foreign ignorance. And when the worst storm in living memory arrived, your haystack saved 31 lives. Our proper wooden houses nearly killed us." Horace Brennan rose next. The lumber merchant's florid face was pale, his usual bluster entirely absent. His own son had survived the blizzard in the house Brennan had ridiculed most enthusiastically. "My boy spent 3 days in Mr. Erickson's home," Brennan said. 3 days warm and safe, while I sat in my own house burning furniture to stay alive. I called him a fool. I called his house a haystack. I told everyone who would listen that it would collapse, burn, or fill with rats. His voice broke. My son is alive because I was wrong. Margaret Lindstrom is dead because I helped convince this town that traditional building methods were foolish. I do not know how to live with that. Others spoke. The Hoffmans, who had fled their home with 4 children in the middle of the night. The Petersons, who had destroyed their own house trying to heat it. The Carlson brothers, who admitted freely that they would have frozen to death without Jonas's shelter. When the testimonies were finished, Jonas walked slowly to the front of the church. He was not a man comfortable with public speaking, and his English, though serviceable, still carried the rhythms of his native Swedish. But some things needed to be said. "In Sweden," he began, "we have winters longer and colder than anything Nebraska has seen. We have learned over many centuries how to build for such winters. The knowledge is not secret. It is not difficult. It is simply different from what Americans have learned." He looked around the room. "I did not build my house to prove a point. I built it because my wife died in a wooden house that could not keep her warm. I built it because I knew a better way, and I could not bear to lose another person I loved to cold that could have been prevented." He paused. "Mrs. Lindstrom is dead, and that is a tragedy that will stay with me. But the rest of you are alive. Your children are alive. And if you wish to learn how to build, as I have built, how to construct walls that the cold cannot penetrate, I will teach you. The materials are free. The grass grows everywhere. The technique is simple. No family in this settlement need ever freeze again if they are willing to do the work." Thank you for watching this story about Jonas Erickson and the Hay-Bale house of Hadley. When we mock what we do not understand, we sometimes lose the chance to learn what might save us. If this story reminded you that the old ways often carry wisdom the new ways have forgotten, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever dismissed your methods as foolish until the day those methods proved essential? That summer, 14 hay-bale structures were built across the Hadley settlement, each one constructed under Jonas's patient supervision. He taught the homesteaders how to cut and compress the grass, how to stack the bales, how to mix and apply the plaster. He showed them the techniques his grandfather had perfected in Sweden, adapted now for the Nebraska prairie. Horace Brennan was among the first to build. He constructed a hay-bale addition to his own house, a thick-walled room that could serve as emergency shelter when the temperatures dropped. He also began selling locally produced hay bales alongside his imported lumber, having finally recognized that fighting the inevitable was less profitable than joining it. Mayor Ferris proposed a resolution recommending hay-bale construction for all new buildings in the Hadley area. The resolution passed unanimously, a remarkable achievement for a governing body that rarely agreed on anything. The phrase "building warm" entered the vocabulary of the Nebraska sandhills. It meant constructing with insulation as the primary concern, prioritizing heat retention over appearance or convention. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about survival that could only be learned through nearly freezing to death. Jonas Eriksson lived in his Hay-Bale house for another 29 years, passing in the autumn of 1916 at the age of 72. He remarried in 1891, a widow named Ingrid, who had lost her first husband to the same blizzard that made Jonas a hero. And together, they raised 3 children in the house that had saved 31 lives. The house still stands. The original bales, now over 130 years old, remain intact beneath their protective plaster. The Hadley Historical Society maintains it as a museum, offering tours to visitors who want to understand how the pioneers survived on a treeless plain where winter meant death for those who built poorly. Above the door, carved in Jonas's own hand sometime in the years after the blizzard, is an inscription in both Swedish and English. Värme är kärlek, warmth is love. His grandfather Olof, who had built with grass on a different continent in a different century, would have smiled at the words and recognized their truth.